Welcome to a special 100th birthday celebration. 2021 will be the official centenary of the Exmoor Pony Society. However, the idea for forming a society was born on November the 26th, 1920. This programme celebrates it being 100 years since local pony breeders, farmers and landowners gathered together in the Red Lion Hotel in Dulverton and set the wheels in motion. The stories that follow were the 6 highest placed entries in the Society's short story competition that has been running during 2020. And we are most grateful to our judge, Victoria Evely, author of the modern-day Exmoor Pony classics, the Katie books. So now, make yourselves comfy, have your nibbles and a glass of something celebratory to hand, and enjoy our Exmoor Pony tales.
Hello, I'm Sarah and this is my story, The Gathering. Mum says, "We're going to Exmoor." Emily was red-faced with excitement, the news bursting from her. "We're going to stay in a caravan and there's a stream and I might ride a real Exmoor pony." She danced across the cracked concrete, spinning with joy, her plastic hair bubbles bouncing and clicking. "And it's all down to you, Mr. Bracken," she said, coming to stop by the pony dozing in his homemade shelter. Suddenly quiet, she laid her face gently against his hairy cheek and breathed in his warm, dusty smell. Bracken was old and kind and cunning. He could steal treats from deep inside your pockets, digging them out with his prehensile top lip. If he didn't feel like being ridden, he would wait until you weren't looking before untying his rope, rolling under the straggles of electric fence and escaping back into his field. He was called Bracken because his coat was the same reddish-brown as bracken on the winter moor. Not that there were any moors on the outskirts of Birmingham where Emily lived. Just roads, houses and flat fields of polythene with pylons striding through. Exmoor, Emily sighed into Bracken's mane. Actual Exmoor, where you came from. "I don't know that for sure," said Val, Bracken's owner. She smiled kindly at Emily. "He's got no papers, and at his age, if he was moorbred, he would have a brand." "Don't care," said Emily fiercely. "You can see what he is. Look at his eyes." It was true that Bracken had the typical Exmoor mealy-coloured eye patches and muzzle. In the summer, his coat was short and glossy, but when autumn came, he grew a double coat of thick, soft wool, overlaid with a longer, greasy pelt. A rain-shedding fan of stiff, waterproof hair sheltered the base of his abundant black tail. He never needed a rug and would stand quite happily in the rain, rump to the wind, droplets running off his whiskers. Silly old sausage, thought Val. As a child, she'd fantasised about owning a Palomino Arab stallion, a wild horse that only she could ride. 40 years on, the dream had solidified into this aged gelding, safe enough for anyone. She wouldn't have chosen differently. There was a wise spark deep in Bracken's hooded eyes. They're called toad eyes, Val remembered. Folklore said real toads had a jewel in their heads. Bracken sighed, shifted his hips and tilted his near hind hoof. "You're my jewel," thought Val. Val first noted Emily in February. Every evening when she got out of her car to unlock the field gate, there was a kid hanging about, aged about 10 or 11, wearing leggings and a pink jacket. The girl shied away when looked at, like some untrained yearling. Most of the teens who hung out on the waste ground at the back of the estate weren't interested in horses. This kid was different. She'd stand alone, staring silently. Val recognised that look of utter longing for impossible treasure. On the fourth evening, Val rode Bracken up the track to the village. The girl was lurking by the hedge, pretending to check her phone. "Hi there," called Val as they passed. "Would you like to stroke him?" The kid did a good pretence of a double take and then shrugged nonchalantly as if she wasn't bothered, but her radiant expression told otherwise. At first she was clumsy and her movements too abrupt, but Bracken was patient. Over time, Emily learned to put on his head collar, lead him in and groom him. She helped Val poo-pick, frowning with disgust at his grassy boluses, amazed by the metallic brown dung beetles that rattled like popcorn in the wheelbarrow. "Ew, gross," became a catchphrase, a kind of secret joke between them. Emily learned to keep her attention on Bracken, forgetting her phone messages. Val learned that Emily had an annoying younger brother called Leo, gross, and a dad who lived elsewhere. One spring Saturday, when dandelion flowers were scattered like gold coins through the grass, Val lent Emily her crash hat and let her ride up the track and back. Soon she could rise to the trot and coax Bracken into a slow canter round the field. But it wasn't really riding, just going 50 yards to the road, and Bracken was lazy when ridden in the field. Although Emily begged to take him through the village and into the woods, Val always refused. "I'm not insured to let you out on him," she explained. "The traffic's too dangerous and I can't take the risk, I'm sorry." At home in their poky flat, Emily spent hours on her phone finding out about Exmoor. The more she learned, the more entranced she became. It wasn't just about the ponies. It was the high heathland, the steep wooded valleys she learned to call coombs, red deer stags with enormous branching antlers, tumbling streams and mossy fairy pools, and a rocky coast with beaches of pink-grey pebbles. "I will go there," she whispered fiercely, "and I'm going to gallop over the moor, on an Exmoor." Emily had never been on holiday. Now and then, her mum's brother, Mike, took them for a day out in his car. So it was a big moment when her mum suddenly announced that they were going to a chalet in Skegness, owned by one of Mike's pals. "It will cost a bit, but not as much as normal, and I've been saving," said Mum. "We can go to the beach, and there are donkeys. You'll like that, Emily." Emily, however, was heartbroken. "I don't want to go to Skeggy and ride a donkey," she sobbed. "Why can't we go to Exmoor so I can ride an actual pony?" Her mum was confounded and then furious. "You ungrateful little cow. All you do is moan. You're spoilt, you are." At night, Emily cried herself to sleep. But the week before the holiday, Mike had some bad news. The chalet boiler had broken and they couldn't stay there after all. "I'm ever so sorry," he said. "I take you all somewhere else, but everywhere will be booked up now." It was Emily's moment. All those furtive hours on the internet were going to pay off. "There's this place," she said, waving her phone. "It's really cheap. We could go there." Let's have a look," said Mike. Basic. It's not a campsite, just a farm." "Might be okay. Where is it?" "Bloody hell, it's miles away, right down in the sodding West Country." "Please, Mike, please, you said you'd take us somewhere," begged Emily. Mike rang the farm. It turned out they'd had a late cancellation. He managed to bargain them down to the same price the chalet would have cost. This achievement pleased him, and he agreed to drive there. "I've got a mate in Helston, might go and see him for a few days, pick you up on the way back." And so Emily, Leo and Mum went to Exmoor. Their home for the week was an old dark green static, perched at the top of a vertiginous grassy field. A hill bulked up behind that. At the bottom of the field there was a stream which rushed and tumbled loudly at night. In the early mornings, ravens flew over the caravan, croaking like corks being pulled. There were noisy sheep and swallows that skimmed low over the pasture, catching insects. Leo was amazed to find a toad crouching in the damp stone wall by the water tap. Without a car, they couldn't go far. They lived on pasta and crisps from the tiny village shop half an hour's walk away. One day they caught a bus, which rumbled and bumped across the hills to Minehead. There they splashed in the sea and ate chips, sausages and some cut-price strawberries. It was wonderful, like being dropped into a new world. But Emily didn't see any Exmoor ponies. Not one. 2 nights before they were due to go home, Mike turned up. He'd had a good time in Cornwall and earned a bit of cash working for a friend. He arrived with 4 aromatic bags of Chinese takeaway. Proper food at last, thought Emily, hungrily. They sat round the caravan table and gorged themselves. Quite a family gathering, said Mike. He pointed his plastic fork at Emily. I got a treat lined up for you. You're going riding tomorrow, just like you wanted. There's a place up on the moor, Exmoor Ponies. I stopped off on the way and booked you in. Emily hardly slept all night. In her imagination, she saw a black mane waving over her hands as they cantered, no, galloped, across miles of heather. There was the usual kerfuffle and delay in leaving the caravan, and by the time they arrived at the stables, most of the riders were already mounted. Emily's gaze flicked over a line of dozy piebald and skewbald cobs. My pony must be in the stable, she thought. She collected a hat, and while Mum filled in various forms, a teenager led her to one of the cobs. You're on, Tinker. Emily was confused. Don't you have any Exmoors? She asked. Course not for trekking. Get on, we're starting in a moment. Stirrups okay? Tuck his head in behind Domino over there. During the ride, Tinker paid no attention whatsoever to Emily. His main concern was to snatch mouthfuls of greenery. The string ambled slowly in single file up a tarmac lane, took a lane by the side of a wood, and then for 10 glorious minutes went along a stony track on the moor. At the very last moment, the ride supervisor asked, Does anyone want to canter? Some horses lurched into a few lacklustre strides before subsiding back into a walk. Tinker refused to do more than trot. Then they returned to the stables. Emily hid her disappointment well. She knew it wasn't Mike or Mum's fault they didn't understand that a pony on Exmoor was not the same as an Exmoor pony. She had ridden a pony on Exmoor. She was lucky to have had such a treat. When they left to go home the next day, Emily could hardly see through unshed tears. Mike chose to detour across the moor. At Brendon Common, the road was lined with parked cars and people were standing on the verges, looking at something in the distance. Mike pulled into a lay-by next to an old stout guy in a waxed coat, obviously a local. What's happening? He called. The man beamed. It's the gathering. We're getting the ponies in for checking. Everyone piled out the car, squinting into the sun. Then Emily saw them. They were far away, and it was as if some of the purple-brown heather had started to move. They came nearer, flowing down the hillside, urged on by girls on horseback and young men on leaping quad bikes. Through a shallow ford in rainbows of spray, to meet with other groups, running at a canter now, mares and stocky foals, nostrils wide. One mare tried to break away and lead her herd back to the ridge, but a girl on a bay hunter swooped in and chased her off. They're crafty ones, chuckled the old man. Down the road they came, snorting and calling, unshod hooves tapping, a pell-mell tumult of tossing manes, shiny coated bodies, dappled with summer condition, a river of Exmoor ponies. As they passed, Emily let out a long breath. Real Exmoor ponies. galloping on Exmoor. Yes, she envied the authoritative girls riding the roundup on their hunters, so casual and so unimaginatively blessed. But it was the free-running Exmoors that stole her heart. "Time to go," said Mike. As I said yesterday, all in all, it's been quite a gathering. He looked at Emily. "Something to tell your friend's old nag about anyway." "I will always remember, and one day I will come back," said Emily.
Taking second place is a great achievement in an open competition when you are aged just 9. So let's now hear Roberta reading her entry, An Exmoor Puzzle.
Hooray! Lucy finally put the last piece of the jigsaw puzzle in. A herd of mealy-muzzled Exmoor ponies stared back at her from the jigsaw. It had been a hard jigsaw to do, so many muted shades of brown on the ponies and surrounding moorland, interspersed with the odd bit of yellow gorse and purple heather. The toad eyes seemed to follow her from one of the little ponies wherever she was in the room. Lucy's mum called for her to go to bed. "And mind, don't be taking any more apples from my fruit bowl tonight, or carrots from the vegetable rack." Lucy thought her mum was going a bit mad. She was always on about this since they'd been on holiday, as if she'd smuggled fruit and vegetables to her bedroom. Lucy awoke with a start. The wind was really howling outside. There was a munching and crunching and who's clopping from below her. Who could it be? She crept cautiously down the stairs, avoiding the creaky floorboards. To her delight, she saw a real-life Exmoor pony right in front of her on the kitchen floor, nosing through the fruit bowl and selecting the tastiest apples. Lucy wanted to scream with delight, but she knew she had to keep this a secret from her mum, and she knew Exmoors could be a bit shy at times, though this one certainly seemed more of the inquisitive type as it lifted its broad head and looked at her. Lucy slowly and calmly approached the pony, who blew softly at her. She patted its shoulder. Something was familiar about those eyes and the highlights in its long, flowing mane. She ran her fingers through the thick, tangled mane, and all of a sudden she felt a cold breeze against her cheeks. She blinked hard. She couldn't believe her eyes. She was no longer in the kitchen. She was on the Exmoor's back, outside where it was daytime. The scene seemed familiar. Golden gorse bushes and amethyst-coloured heather, and amongst it was a herd of Exmoor ponies, one with a little foal. This was strange. How had she got there? Where was she? How could she get back? Lucy's mind was racing. Then it all became clear. The scene was familiar because it was the one she'd been working on for the last couple of weeks in her jigsaw. The Exmoor who had seemed to watch her was the pony who was eating the apples and the carrots. An adventure was unfolding before her eyes. The moor's mist started to come down. This was something her mum had always warned her about on Exmoor. The pony seemed unfazed by this, unlike Lucy. Lucy murmured under her breath, "This is really scary." And to Exmoor, the one that she was riding, said in human language, "Don't worry, we're used to this. It happens nearly every day." And as soon as he had finished talking, Lucy jumped with surprise. She now knew that these Exmoor ponies weren't just any Exmoor ponies. They were magic ones. "Come on, we'll show you around our home, the moor," said one of the Exmoors. The herd all raced off with Lucy safely on top. First they took her to the very top of the moors and showed her the wonderful view of the glimmering sea with the reflection of the steaming hot sun. It really was a wonderful view. Then a different Exmoor with a rounded tummy and a noble head told her to look behind her, and Lucy saw the mist they had left behind, and some sheep had now gone to graze where she and the Exmoors had been, by the yellow gorse bushes and the purple heather. Holding on to the thick mane, Lucy rode down the steep hill, feeling pleased that all the Exmoor ponies were sure-footed. As they got down the hill, the Exmoor said, "Hang on, we're going over a ditch." So Lucy clung to the Exmoor's long dark mane while they popped over the gaping ditch. Lucy could tell the Exmoor had done this before. After they had all jumped over the ditch, the Exmoors took her left to show her where they shelter from the rain and wind. Next, they all went to the tar steps, big flat stepping stones. Then one of the Exmoor ponies, with rounder eyes, nudged her as if to say, "Go and have a go." Slowly, Lucy nudged her Exmoor onto the first stepping stone and then jumped for one another, there and back. The pony was incredible, so confident on the slippery stones. Lucy was having the time of her life. The leader of the herd suddenly cocked its head, and the rest stood rock still, listening. Lucy could feel her pony's heart beating beneath her. Without any warning, they were galloping away from the tar steps. Through the sunlit woods, trees were racing past her. Faster and faster they went. Soon they steadied, and the mother of the foal gently whickered to her baby. Lucy said, "What was that all about?" The Exmoor with the noble head explained that he'd heard a cracking sound and thought the herd should run to safety. As they headed back up the hill, Lucy could see what had caused the noise. The giant tree, which the ponies used for shelter, had come crashing down onto the track between the two moors. Her Exmoor went to look at it, blowing at the debris on the ground, showing its inquisitive nature. The herd gently walked further up the track, taking care to surround the foal, who was looking tired. Soon the moor opened out, and the mare nudged her baby, who was only too pleased to lie down in the shade of a gorse bush. Soon the rest of the herd copied, leaving only the noble-headed Exmoor and Lucy's pony still standing. Lucy felt she should slip down from the pony, and as she did so, it turned to look at her. She ran her fingers through the thick, tangled mane. Lucy woke, rubbing her eyes. Where was she? She was back in her comfy bed. Was it a dream? Lucy thought. She went downstairs. The Exmoor's toad eyes looked at her from the jigsaw in a knowing way. She then looked in the fruit bowl, and the apples were still missing. It was a puzzle. The end.
The story that took third place in this year's competition was by Andrew Robinson from Bedfordshire. Andrew reads for us now, The Spirit of Exmoor.
The Spirit of Exmoor by Andrew Robinson. What's the spirit of Exmoor, you ask? Well, it depends who you speak to, I suppose. A summer holiday maker would probably wax lyrical about the honey-laden scent of heather-clad hills, or the crash of Bristol Channel breakers in some remote sandy cove. We locals might reflect on the moor's other moods, the thick hill fogs, lanes slick with the mud of damp autumn days, or the amyl or hoarfrost sparkling silver in the light of a winter's dawn. But I know better. You see, I've met the true spirit. I set off early that morning, just as dawn broke. Walking up the winding lane, the village silent and slumbering behind me, I met the postman driving down the hill. We stopped to exchange pleasantries. Where'd be grain this time of the morning then? I explained I was heading out across the common. There was a group of stags laid up in a coombe some 5 miles distant that I was hoping to photograph. He looked at me doubtfully. You sure? Nasty bit of snow on the way, I reckon. It was my turn to look doubtful. The paling sky was almost perfectly clear, with a sharp stillness in the air that foretold a glorious day. And so, with my friend shaking his head and muttering all sorts of dire warnings, I set off confidently up the rise. I was breathing hard as I neared the top, my breath misting thickly about my face, so I didn't immediately notice the creaking of the bare beech limbs above me. The sharp screech of branch on branch made me look up. Ahead of me the hedge banks parted, and the road struck out across the wide open expanse of the common. The wind that was shaking the trees so violently hissed through the dead grass and bracken and sent a few frozen leaves skittering about my feet. Then the sharp shadows cast by the newly risen sun lost their definition, faded, and vanished. I turned. A dark mass of bruised cloud was piling up, filling the eastern sky, blotting out the sun. I stood for about a minute, eyes watering into the wind, weighing up my options. On the face of it, the sensible thing to do would be to heed my friend's advice and beat a hasty retreat for home. But the sky across the common was still clear, and the thought of capturing the stags on camera in such photogenic wintry conditions lured me on. I simply had to photograph this herd, I convinced myself, as I stepped off the road and onto the narrow sheep track that headed across the open moorland. I was halfway across the common when the first flakes began to fall. At first I didn't notice them, so intent was I on picking my way over the uneven terrain. But then one after another kissed my cheeks in quick succession, and I lifted my gaze to find that I was rapidly being enveloped by a curtain of snow. The sky that had been so clear before me was now leaden and grey, and it suddenly seemed as though the wind was buffeting me with a fresh intensity. Though I could hardly bring myself to acknowledge it, I had to admit that I was in a precarious position. I was now a good 2.5 miles from the road, across uneven, open ground with little shelter. My intended destination was almost as distant, but downhill from here, and with the prospect of a temporary refuge amongst the thickly wooded sides of the coombe. What possessed me, I don't know, but I decided that if I continued my descent to lower ground, the force of the storm would not be so bad, and that by the time I had to make my way home, the worst of the weather would have passed. So I pressed on, my head sunk between my shoulders, and all the while the snow continued to fall. It was falling down a short bank and plunging up to my calves in snow that brought me to my senses. Forget the deer, I muttered. If the snow was starting to drift this deep, then it really was time for me to head home. Cursing myself for not coming to this conclusion earlier, I shook clinging white clumps from me and started to haul myself back up the hill. But this time I was head into the wind, and whereas before I had merely had to contend with the uneven ground, I now had the blizzard full in my face. And it was unquestionably a blizzard. The wind roared about me, and there was nothing in front of me except a blank grey canvas thickly speckled with whirling dots. My face ached with the cold, and the freezing air burnt my throat. Every stumbling step took me closer towards home, but it also sapped my waning energy. It may have been 10 minutes, or it may have been an hour or more, before I came upon a stunted hawthorn. It emerged out of the maelstrom in front of me like a phantom, crooked arms grasping wildly at me in the wind. Perched on a small hummock, it was the only thing providing even a modicum of shelter in the whirling whiteness of the moor. I crouched against the leeward side of the narrow trunk, pressing myself into its gnarled embrace. Through half-shut eyes, I watched the snow piling up against my boots, and, with a strange air of detachment, realized I was going to die here. The snow would continue to build, softly and slowly covering me as gently as any eiderdown, lulling me into the deepest of all sleeps. I would be just one more undulation in the vast white sheet that would cover the hills. At the rate it was falling, it would surely last for weeks. There would be no hope of any searchers finding me. And then, as the drifts gradually melted beneath the first breath of spring, my body too would melt, slowly, inexorably down into the peat and earth and stone of the moor. In this world of cold, I suddenly felt a warm breath on my cheek, heard a gentle throaty exhalation. Blinking stupidly, I looked up. There, shaggy winter coat standing out starkly against the surrounding snow, was an Exmoor pony. Even in my distressed state, I was surprised that it had come so close to me. These wild little horses might be notionally owned by various farmers, but they're a law unto themselves, and usually stay proudly aloof of anybody trying to get too near. and yet there it stood, only a couple of inches away, gazing steadily at me. Then, with a small jerk of its head, it turned and walked a couple of paces, looked back and found my gaze once more. It was telling me as clearly as it could without words that it wanted me to follow it. The small core of my brain that was still working properly was amazed, yet there was no doubting its intent. Well, I thought, I can't be any worse off than if I stay here. Clawing my way up the tree, I pulled myself upright and staggered a few paces towards the pony. With what sounded like a small whinny of satisfaction, it walked on a few feet, then stopped and looked over its shoulder to make sure I was following. I stumbled after it. It all seemed too bizarre to be true, but in that moment I was simply glad to have some companionship, another beating heart with me out there in the wilderness. And my heart was beating stronger now, pushing blood back to my frozen limbs as each step gradually chipped away at the ice-cold dread that had been enveloping me. Hope returned with movement, but I was still struggling. I longed to be able to lean upon that strong flank of the beast ploughing ahead of me, to grab hold of the thick hair of its mane and have it pull me along. But any time I got close enough to reach out a hand towards it, the little animal would toss its head and make a brief canter away from me. And so we went on, some invisible tether holding me close behind my guide as we plodded slowly through the snowstorm. With the blood flowing more freely through me, I began to regain my faculties, and could better admire my gallant companion. She was evidently a mare, and, whilst I was no expert, a very handsome one at that. With her thick bay winter coat, she seemed impervious to the cold, long eyelashes keeping out the stinging flakes, sturdy legs never faltering as she steered a steady course across the moor. Perfectly designed over millennia for just this sort of environment, I thought. I don't know how long we walked through the storm. I had a curious sense that we were right out of time and space, the pony and me the only two souls in a vast, white universe. Then suddenly, I tripped, fell, and one of my hands struck something hard. Wincing, I lifted it, and looked in wonder at the small black patch of tarmac beneath. In amazement, I slowly swept my hand across the ground, revealing more of the road's surface. Stifling a sob, I looked up to see the beech trees I had walked underneath a lifetime ago at the start of my trek. I scrambled up, turning to look at the mare, who regarded me impassively. "Thank you," I whispered, a tear of relief freezing on my cheek. We stood before each other as the wind dropped and the snow lessened. Then, slowly, I stepped forward and reached out. This time she did not turn away as I gently laid my hand upon her muzzle. As I did so, her outline seemed to blur, a haze of colours drifting from her, and I saw her for what she truly was. The mealiness of her muzzle was the grey lichen cloaking ancient oaks on the coombe sides. Big, dark eyes were the deep, sun-dappled pools of the East Lynn in the heat of a summer's afternoon. The thick hair on her deep chest was the bracken turning russet on the sloping hillsides. Beads of snowmelt clinging there were the wurts, the flowers of ling and of furze. In the swish of her tail, I saw the wind bending the eastward-leaning trees on the high ground. The clumps of snow it sent whirling into the air were clouds scudding across a bright spring sky. The shading of her coat to a paler colour on her belly was as the dawn sky over Dunkery, or the sun setting far out over the Severn Sea. Then she neighed loudly, and I heard in that cry the mewing of buzzards, the bleating lambs, the baying of hounds, and the bolving stags. A kaleidoscope of colour and sound, all the moods and sights of the moor, something elemental and timeless, all brought together in this one beautiful animal. All this I saw, heard, felt in a moment. Then I blinked, and there was just me and the pony, stood quietly on the half-buried road in the gently falling flakes. Once more she stepped backwards, gave a soft whinny, and whirled around. A flurry of snow, and her outline faded, disappeared. She was gone. I stood staring for some moments, before turning and shuffling off along the road, back down the hill to the safety of hearth and home. I sat for many hours, thawing and thinking before the fire. What was the nature of my saviour? Had she been a figment of my stressed imagination? An unusually friendly pony of flesh and blood? Or something else? Perhaps the real spirit of Exmoor? Think what you like. I know what I believe.
Now we're going to hear the fourth place story, written by Claire Morrish from Cornwall, The Connection.
As Cathy walked up the bridle path to the field, she called to Sherry, her Exmoor mare, and was greeted by a shrill call which seemed to be much closer than usual. Looking up, Cathy saw through the hedge, where an ash tree was a little sparse, Sherry's pretty face looking back. Immediately, Cathy was worried. She shouldn't have been able to see Sherry at all, as that section of the field was gated to keep Sherry out, there being a greenhouse and other potential hazards in it. Sherry was only normally allowed in there under supervision and couldn't get in there by herself. That could only mean one thing. Someone had got into the field. Hurrying now, Cathy and her husband Alex reached the main field gate, unlocking both padlocks to get in. Looking around the side of the stable building, there was a scene of chaos. Stuff was scattered everywhere. Tools were lying around in the mud with baler twine, nails, pot plants, all sorts. Intruders had broken into their storage shed by bashing and breaking the wooden grid above the lower door, but hadn't been able to get through the bottom door itself. The hole in the grid had allowed what must have been a small person to get inside the shed and then pass things outside. Consequently, every crate, box and bag which had been inside had been tipped outside, so their contents could be searched. "Not again," Alex said. "I can't believe the scoundrels have been here again. There's nothing left here to nick. We don't keep any power tools here or anything now." "I'm getting fed up with this," said Cathy. "There's nothing left worth taking except hand tools and the big battery." "They're only interested in power tools and stuff they can sell. They don't want to do any actual work. They've tried to move the battery by the looks of it. Good luck with that, it weighs a ton," Alex commented. "Perhaps they're raising money for Christmas," joked Cathy. "They'll need extra money for that." "I'll ring and get a crime number to go with the others," sighed Alex, reaching for his mobile phone. This was the fourth break-in during the previous 2 years. On the first occasion, thieves had taken a decent petrol-driven strimmer and a broken chainsaw. After each break-in, security had been improved. Extra padlocks with chains, and there being no mains electricity at the field, a solar-powered CCTV camera installed. Being motion activated, this had mostly captured shots of Sherry going in and out of her stable, and various birds, cats and hedgehogs. This usually drained the power out of the camera, so it stopped recording. Power tools were now kept at home, and Cathy, paranoid that someone would try to catch and steal Sherry, kept all the tack and head collars at home. This was a nuisance, as she had to carry everything she needed back and forth each day. But at least she knew thieves would have to come prepared. Their house insurance would cover them for any thefts from their home, but no insurance company was likely to give them cover, unless it was a completely unaffordable rate, for a remote property at which they were not resident, having suffered break-ins already. Police had been called every time, but after a spate of break-ins at different properties along the bridle path, had not caught anyone, there being insufficient evidence to provide a good lead. One police officer had told them their security was good, but if thieves really wanted to get in, they would just cut through the back of the sheds, thinking there was something inside worth taking. The police were keen to stomp out countryside thefts, which were on the increase, with thieves taking really expensive machinery and equipment at lots of farms and outbuildings. It seemed that Cathy and Alex's property was very small and insignificant in comparison to others, but the police promised they would follow up any evidence they received. The feed shed was the most secure, as Cathy could only imagine how much of the chicken's corn Sherry would eat should burglars leave the feed shed and corn bin open. They had done their best, but had still been targeted. "At least they didn't harm Sherry or the chickens," said Alex, "and that's the main thing." They were both quiet at that point, as on one occasion 3 of their pet chickens had been beaten to death and another one injured so badly that only tender care by their daughter had enabled the hen to recover. Cathy and Alex were resigned to the fact that the break-ins would never stop. Sherry's habit of urinating in the main gateway, despite having a 3-acre field to use, probably deterred most opportunists wearing a good pair of trainers from treading in it, as they would stink for hours. Now, thieves seemed to be getting through the hedge, then disabling the camera by hitting it, so the camera recorded fabulous shots of the sky instead of the sheds. There seemed little they could do except clean the place up again. "I don't think they'll be back today," said Alex, locking up the main gate. "I wouldn't put it past them to come back again, though," said Cathy gloomily. "I don't know what time of day they came, but it can't be late at night, as there was only one pile of dung where Sherry was shut in, and if she had been there all night, there would have been more than that. I reckon she was only there for a couple of hours, early this morning, before anyone was about." Cathy decided she would revisit the field later whilst Alex was at work, to check nobody came back, just in case. That evening, Cathy checked all the gates, then settled into a corner of Sherry's stable, where she intended to wait for an hour or so before going home. She texted Alex to let him know she was all right, as he had early been worried about her being there on her own. "I won't be on my own," she had said. "Sherry will be with me." The stable was not really silent. Sherry was munching some more hay. There was no way that a visit to the stable at an unfamiliar time was going to be a missed opportunity for more food. The rustling trees outside and the sounds of the feral cats moving in various sheds covered any potential sounds made by intruders. Cathy didn't want to talk aloud in case anybody heard her. Her mind, however, was busy, while her ears strained to hear any unusual sounds outside. "You're quiet tonight," a voice said. Cathy jumped and looked about. Surely someone hadn't crept into the stable without being heard. "Are you waiting for someone?" the voice continued. "Hello, who's that?" Cathy called. "Don't say you don't know who I am," replied the voice. It seemed to be coming from Sherry, too close not to be her, but when she heard the voice, Sherry's lips didn't move. "It sounds like you are talking, Sherry, but I can't see your lips moving," said Cathy. "I'm not moving my lips. You are hearing my thoughts," replied Sherry. "I must be going mental," thought Cathy. "Alex will be locking me up if I tell him Sherry has been talking back to me." "You're not going mental," replied Sherry. This really surprised Cathy, as she hadn't spoken these words out loud. "How can you do that?" she asked. "I can't usually," replied Sherry, "but when it's quiet like this, I have more chance of getting through." "Have you tried before?" asked Cathy. Not often, admitted Sherry, because usually we have a good connection together. You normally work out what I want and how I'm feeling, so I don't need to try, which makes it easier. I haven't been able to do it with anyone else. We don't need to use our voices to communicate. Cathy tried to take this in and thought her next questions instead of speaking aloud. This is amazing. There's so much I want to ask you, she thought excitedly. I want to ask if you're happy with us here, if you get bored because you don't go out hacking very often, what you've been eating when you get colic, loads of things. One question at a time, Sherry replied. I've got questions of my own, like, why don't we go into the empty green fields round here when we are out, especially when the gates are open? Cathy explained that the empty green fields were not their territory, so she wasn't allowed in them. The concept of land ownership was more difficult to explain to an Exmoor pony, whose ancestors would have wandered freely wherever they choose. But eventually, Cathy did it. She hoped their next hack would not be marked by the usual tug-of-war to get past an open gateway. Sherry told her she didn't mind staying at home, although a change of scenery was always welcome, that she had everything she needed and was quite happy, which put Cathy's mind at rest. I always worry about you, Cathy told Sherry, especially when things happen, like the break-in earlier. Can you tell me about them? Yes, there were 3 of them, 2 men and a girl. The girl was thin. She was the one who climbed over the storage shed. One of the men smashed the wood so she could get in, and he passed the stuff over the field gate to a man who put it in a truck parked in the bridle path. I wish we had some way of catching them, said Cathy. Did you see them touch anything? They had gloves on when they broke in, thought Sherry. Before that, they looked through the back window of my stable, standing on the rainwater tank. One man wasn't wearing gloves then because he was tapping on the window trying to frighten me, and the girl was trying to make her phone light up to shine through the window. At first, I thought they were bringing me some treats. Lots of passers-by do that here, even though you've put a sign telling them not to. All contributions greatly received as far as I'm concerned, she giggled. Cathy ignored this last comment, concentrating on what Sherry had said before. There may be some usable fingerprints, she thought. She decided to contact the police next morning to get someone to take fingerprints from the window pane. There might also be footprints on the rainwater tank. Realising she had been 3 hours instead of just 1, Cathy reluctantly ended their conversation to get home before Alex finished work. She thanked Sherry for their conversation, hoping to do it again. Sherry hoped the same, as she had enjoyed talking and being understood. Next day, the police took fingerprints from the glass. A photo was taken of the footprints on the rainwater butt and the tyre marks in the mud of the bridle path. Weeks later, Cathy and Alex read in their local newspaper that 3 people had been charged with countryside thefts after evidence found locally connected them to other rural sites where footprints and tyre tracks had been left by the small gang. Although Alex and Cathy knew what had happened, admitting that their pony had talked to Cathy, giving information to lead to the gang's prosecution, they didn't think telling others about it would be believed. Cathy knew she would try and keep her mind open for Sherry to get through the next time she wanted to talk. It was such an incredible miracle that she didn't think she would ever get over it. She hoped their connection would last for a long time to come.
Next, Susanna Baker from County Durham reads her 5th place story, Honeycomb Bill from Winsford Hill.
Honeycomb Bill from Winsford Hill. Out on the moor on a sunshiny day lay a posse of foals watching a nosy jay, when suddenly Up on his feet and off at a trot went Honeycomb Bill from Winsford Hill. Next up was Dulverton Spud, completely covered in mud, who raced after Honeycomb Bill from Winsford Hill. Joining in the fun came Wellshead Gale with her black swishy tail, dancing behind Dulverton Spud, completely covered in mud, and Honeycomb Bill from Winsford Hill. Not to be left out was Chainborough Clare, like a huge fluffy bear, trotting alongside Wellshead Gale with her black swishy tail, Dulverton Spud, completely covered in mud, and Honeycomb Bill from Winsford Hill. What's going on? Thought Luckworthy Bert, looking proud and alert, as he followed Chainborough Clare like a huge fluffy bear. Wellshead Gale with her black swishy tail, Dulverton Spud, completely covered in mud, and Honeycomb Bill from Winsford Hill. "Wait for me!" whinnied Peggy, all gangly and leggy, chasing after Luckworthy Bert, looking proud and alert, Chainborough Clare like a huge fluffy bear, Wellshead Gale with her black swishy tail, Dulverton Spud, completely covered in mud, and Honeycomb Bill from Winsford Hill. With heads in the air, no time to wait, through bog, heather, gorse to Mounsey Hill gate, they spooked at the adder and jumped at each lamb, when suddenly out of the bracken they saw Westansty King, the toughest stag on the moor. "Roar!" bellowed Westansty King. Off with a start, a buck and a fart, a kerfuffle of hooves and stampeding moves, galloped Danquery Peggy, all gangly and leggy, Luckworthy Bert, looking proud and alert, Chainborough Clare, like a huge fluffy bear, Wellshead Gale with her black swishy tail, Dulverton Spud, completely covered in mud, and Honeycomb Bill from Winsford Hill. Over the bank, under the beech, through the bracken, all the way back to Mum. The end.
And finally, over to Sue Berger in Carmarthenshire for her 6th placed entry, Mouse's Foal.
The ponies were drifting along the top of the ridge, catching the warmth of the early morning sun as it skimmed the top off the mist rising up from the river valley. Jim lowered his binoculars. He had just watched as the herd splashed through the ford upstream of the old Packhorse Bridge. It was early May, and he counted 5 foals following the 8 mares. 2 of the mares without foals are making heavy weather of the climb, their expectant bellies hampering their progress. He'd been following the herd for a few weeks and had quickly learned where to find them depending on the time of day and the weather conditions. 2 of the foals had been born overnight and had that newborn uncertainty about where each leg should go in relation to the other 3. As he watched, one of the foals yawned and slowly folded to the ground, where it stretched flat out. Its mother stood, one hind leg cocked, and dozed while her baby slept. The herd stallion, a gentle old chap, brought up the rear and stood on watch while his family relaxed in the warming sun. The ponies were free-living Exmoors, the mares unhandled and wild as the red deer they shared the moors with. Every one of them was purebred, with a pedigree that could be traced back more than 100 years. Jim would tell people that the ponies looked as though they'd grown out of the moor, they were such a part of it. Their colouring, ranging from a bright conker bay to a deep russet, reflected the colours of the moorland landscape they inhabited. Their shape mirrored the gorse bushes that grew freely and provided the ponies with shelter and sustenance through the harsh upland winters. Many a time Jim had traipsed across the heather towards a group of ponies, only to find himself approaching an uninviting stand of prickly gorse. Jim's grandfather, Ambrose,
had been an Exmoor farmer and had owned a herd of ponies back in the early years of the 20th century, long before they were recognised as a rare and special breed. But Ambrose had known there was something special about them. No other breed of pony had that quick, alert and active look about them. No other breed displayed that intelligence and ability to survive the privations of modern life. When the Second World War started, Ambrose had been called up to fight. He was sent across the English Channel to the battlefields of France, and like so many of his generation, he never returned to his Exmoor home. His young widow was forced to sell the farm, and, along with it, the grazing rights on the moor. The pony herd was dispersed, purchased by other moorland breeders, and most of the bloodlines died out. Many were casualties of the war, and few ponies were to be found on the moor when hostilities ceased. Just one mare remained from Ambrose's herd, and Jim was watching her last descendant, Mouse, grazing the short moorland turf just a couple of 100 yards from where he was sitting. Jim lived and worked in London, but spent as much of his time as he could on Exmoor. It was where he had been brought up, on the fringes of Dulverton. He had married young, a city girl, but it hadn't worked out. Their differences proved insurmountable. His passion had become Exmoor and its little brown ponies. It was where he felt truly at home, and where he could be his true self. He would spend hours every day watching the ponies and the red deer, and probably knew the moor as well, if not better than many locals. He felt as much a part of the moor as the ponies. His family had farmed on Exmoor for generations before his grandfather's time. Over the past few years, Jim had been photographing the ponies and moorland landscapes. He had built up a good reputation, winning competitions, staging exhibitions, and selling several photos. His success had enabled him to reduce the hours he worked in his day job. This morning he had captured some atmospheric scenes of the ponies emerging from the mist as they moved up the hill from the river. The photos were just what he needed to complete his project. His mare, as he thought of her, was one of the two yet to foal. It was her first foal, and Jim wanted to keep a close eye on her. He had become good friends with Sarah, the herd's owner. Spring was a busy time for an Exmoor farmer, and an extra pair of eyes was always welcome. Reassured that all was well, Jim made his way down to Sarah's farm to let her know she had 2 new additions to her herd. The kettle was on in the welcoming kitchen. "I thought you'd be along soon," Sarah greeted Jim. "No sign of Mouse's foal, then?" "Looking fit to pop," he said, pulling out a chair and sitting at the table. "Could you see what they are?" she asked. "Couldn't get close enough. Time will tell." Sarah had lived on her farm for 20 years and had gradually built up a herd of some of the rarer mare lines. She had developed a reputation for breeding good moorland ponies, with enough quality to succeed in the show ring, although she didn't show ponies herself. She had been a widow for 3 years and was always glad of Jim's company. "Have you had breakfast? Bacon butty?" Jim smiled. Wouldn't say no. He often found himself in Sarah's kitchen at mealtimes, and she seemed to enjoy his being there. They had grown close since Jim had found out that Mouse was a member of Sarah's herd, and he felt at home and comfortable in her company. Later, when he got back to the B&B, which had become his second home, he uploaded the morning's photos and deleted all but the ones that met his high standards. He was working on a book on Exmoor through the seasons, and the foal photos would be perfect for illustrating the spring months. He spent the rest of the day taking more landscape photos before popping into the pub next door for a bite to eat and a pint. The next morning Jim woke before dawn. It was going to be an unusually fine day for Exmoor. He decided to make an early start finding the ponies. He had a pretty good idea where they would be, and half an hour after leaving his car, he caught sight of the herd in a shallow dip between 2 hills. He did a quick head count. The foals were all snoozing in the first rays of the sun, but there were only 7 mares. Jim realised it was his mouse that was missing, which could only mean one thing. Moving as quietly as he could, he skirted round the herd, constantly scanning for any sign of the mare. He found her on the other side of a clump of gorse, flat out on her side with her foal half born. She was breathing heavily and he could see patchy sweat on her side. He watched for a few minutes. He could see a nose and 2 legs emerging. Mouth suddenly grunted, heaved herself to her feet, and the foal slithered gently to the ground. Immediately she turned round and began to nudge and lick her newborn. Jim was enthralled. He had never seen a foal born and was amazed at how Mouse knew instinctively what to do. The foal lifted its head and gave a little shake. Mouse carried on cleaning it all over. A few minutes later, the foal stretched out its forelegs and attempted to pull itself upright. It took no more than 10 minutes to find its feet, and very soon was searching for its first feed. Mouse nudged it gently in the right direction, and soon it was happily suckling with its tail twirling ecstatically. Jim had been so caught up by what he was seeing that he'd completely forgotten to get his camera out. So quickly he attached the correct lens and captured some new mother and baby shots. The foal finished its first feed, and Mouse turned and looked straight at Jim. Then slowly and deliberately she walked towards him, her foal pressed close to her side. She stopped only a few feet away. "You clever girl," said Jim, taking a step towards her. She pricked her ears but didn't move. Jim took another few steps and she watched with interest. He was close enough to touch her. He stood as quiet and still as he could, murmuring wordless nonsense to the ponies. The foal took a few tentative steps so that it was standing just in front of its mother and stretched its nose out to touch Jim. He slowly moved his right hand until the foal's muzzle was resting on his palm. He tickled under its chin, watching Mouse to make sure that what he was doing was okay with her. The foal allowed him to run its hand down his neck to scratch its withers. Jim could have sworn that Mouse was looking at him approvingly. They stayed close to Jim for another few minutes. Then Mouse decided it was time to rejoin the herd. She turned and walked away with her foal following. As the foal turned, it twitched its tail, giving Jim a clear view of its gender. He watched as they made their way back to the rest of the herd and headed straight down to Sarah's to tell her the news. He was grinning like the Cheshire Cat as he opened the kitchen door. Sarah was washing up with the radio on. "Morning," said Jim. She turned, looked at him and said, "Mouse has foaled." It was a statement, not a question. There was no doubting from his expression. "She has, and it's a filly." Jim then told Sarah what Mouse had done, and she said, "It sounds as though this one who has decided who she belongs to. Welcome to the family." Jim folded Sarah in his arms and asked, "If I'm part of the family, does that mean I can name my foal?" Sarah didn't need to reply. "I'm going to call her Rosa, in honour of Grandad Ambrose, and one day she will be a show champion and have beautiful foals of her own." "In that case," said Sarah, smiling, "I'd better put the kettle on for a celebratory cup of tea."
This is rather a good place to end our storytelling, with the birth of a foal marking the birth of the idea for the society. Well, what a feast of stories we have heard. Thank you to all our authors and readers, and thanks to all the competition entrants as well. In the near future, all the entries will be available to read on the Society's website, and the web address will be given in the closing credits. The full collection of stories represent a literary gift to the future from our present. 100 years ago, those who gathered in the Red Lion in Dulverton sent a very special gift to us, the survival of the Exmoor pony.